Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Western Tales. Tonight, I want to share with you a story about mercy, about a man who'd buried his faith so deep in the frozen earth, he thought it could never thaw again. But sometimes, the prairie has its own way of testing the heart and reminding a man that miracles don't always ride in on horses. Sometimes, they arrive in silence. It happened in the Montana Territory, near a lonely stretch called Hollow Creek. The year was 1887, a winter so cruel it turned every breath to smoke and every prayer to frost. Jacob Rowe rode alone through that storm, wrapped in a coat too thin for the cold and a sorrow too heavy for one man to bear. His hat brim was iced over, his beard white as the hills. He wasn't out hunting or trading, he was just moving, trying to outpace ghosts. 2 years before, he'd lost both his wife and their newborn boy. Pneumonia took them 3 days apart. Since then, Jacob had spoken mostly to his horse, a brown mare named Grace, and to God, though, some nights. He wasn't sure either one was listening. The wind howled through the valley like something alive. Snow fell sideways, thick and sharp, stinging his face. He pulled the reins, squinting into the storm. Grace snorted and stopped dead, ears pinned back. "What is it?" "Girl," he muttered. There was nothing ahead, just white on white, drifting and shifting. But then he saw it, a shape half buried near the bend of the frozen creek, small, still, wrong. Jacob dismounted, boots sinking deep into the powder. The snow bit through his gloves as he brushed it away. What he uncovered stopped his breath cold. It was a basket, woven willow, the kind made by careful hands. Inside, wrapped in a wool shawl stitched with the initials A.M., lay a baby girl, blue-lipped, silent, her tiny lashes frosted with ice. Jacob just stared. For a moment, the world went quiet. No wind, no sound, just that tiny, fragile life between his hands and the memory of another he couldn't save. He whispered, almost afraid to touch her. "Not again, Lord. Not again." But she didn't move, didn't cry. And that silence terrified him more than any outlaw or winter storm ever could. He pressed his fingers to her chest. A faint beat, slow, weak. But there, "Come on, little one. You're not done yet." Jacob stripped off his gloves, held her against his chest beneath his coat. The cold stabbed him like knives. But he didn't care. Her skin was ice. He could feel her ribs like bird bones. He climbed back into the saddle, clutching her tight. "Easy, Grace," he said, voice trembling. "Let's get her home." The mare lunged forward through the snow. Behind them, the wind erased every trace of where she'd been, the basket, the footprints, all of it gone, like the world wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. Jacob rode hard. His breath came in ragged clouds. He could feel the baby's shallow heartbeat against him, fading, then returning, fading again. Every time it stuttered, he whispered a prayer. Not a loud one, just enough for God to hear over the storm. The journey back to his cabin felt endless. Trees blurred by in gray shapes. The sky was a dying ember. When he finally reached the ridge above Hollow Creek, the wind cut out. Sudden and strange, like the storm itself was watching, Jacob pushed through the final drift, slid off the saddle, and half stumbled to the door. He kicked it open, the hinges groaning. Inside, the air was as cold as the plains. The hearth was dead. The cabin smelled of dust and silence. He laid the baby on the table, fumbling for flint and steel. His hands shook. The spark caught. Smoke rose. Then flame. Hold on. Sweetheart, he murmured. Just hold on. The firelight flickered across the baby's face, pale, almost translucent. He found an old bottle, warmed some goat's milk, burned his fingers trying to get it right. The baby turned away at first, weak, barely conscious. He begged her, please. Little one, try. Then, a sound, a thin cry. Small but fierce, the cry of someone refusing to give up. Jacob froze, staring down in disbelief. That sound, it split him wide open. He laughed and sobbed in the same breath. The first real sound he'd made in years that wasn't talking to ghosts. At the girl, he whispered. You fight. He wrapped her tighter, fed the fire until it roared. He sat down in his old chair, rocking her awkwardly, humming a tune he half remembered from church long ago. The baby's crying quieted. Her breathing steadied. Her fingers, impossibly small, curled around his thumb. He sat there till dawn, afraid to move, afraid she might vanish like everything else he'd ever loved. When light finally slipped through the window, soft and gold, he looked down at her. Her face had color now, faint, but real. Her lips no longer blue. She was sleeping. He whispered, Guess it's you and me now. Then added, almost to himself, You're a miracle I wasn't looking for. Outside, the wind had stopped. The first sunlight broke over Hollow Creek, glinting on the snow like 1,000 tiny candles. Inside, a man who'd thought his heart had turned to stone held a sleeping child against his chest, and for the first time in 2 years, Jacob Rowe felt something warm inside him that wasn't fire, something like hope. By the time Jacob Rowe closed the cabin door behind him, the world outside had vanished into white. He leaned his back against the wood, breath ragged, snow melting down his coat. The tiny bundle in his arms still and frighteningly quiet for a heartbeat. The only sound was the wind pressing against the walls and his own pulse hammering in his ears. He looked down that little face, pale as milk glass, eyes barely open. Her lips were still blue. Come on. Sweetheart, stay with me. His voice cracked like an old branch. Jacob dropped to his knees beside the cold hearth. Fumbling for kindling, his fingers were stiff, clumsy. Flint struck once. Twice, nothing. Don't you quit on me, he muttered. To himself or to God? He couldn't tell. Finally, the spark caught. Smoke rose, thin and gray. Then a single tongue of flame flickered up, trembling like the life he was trying to save. He held the baby close, letting the fire's warmth reach her through his coat. Her chest rose once, shallow and slow. Then again, Jacob's eyes burned. Though the air was freezing, he whispered, That's it. Breathe. Little one, breathe. He moved fast, now found an old pot, scraped frost from the water bucket, set it near the flame. He poured in a bit of goat's milk from a bottle Sarah had once used for injured animals. He held it too close to the fire, desperate to warm it, and the bottle hissed. The smell of scorched milk filled the cabin. Damn fool, he growled, snatching it back. He tested it on his wrist, just like he remembered Sarah doing. Too hot, then too cold. He cursed again, but softer this time, almost laughing through the tears that he didn't even notice were falling. All right, we'll try again. He said, "Ain't no giving up tonight." The baby stirred, whimpering faintly. Her small mouth opened, seeking warmth, life, something. Jacob brought the bottle to her lips. For a moment, she turned away. Then, hunger won. She latched, drinking with weak, uneven gulps. Jacob froze. The sound, that tiny, desperate suckling, it filled the whole cabin, filled the space where silence had lived for years. He let out a long breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Good girl," he whispered. "You keep fighting." The fire cracked louder now, feeding on dry wood and willpower. Heat began to spread through the little room. Color returned to the baby's cheeks, faint pink, replacing the deathly blue. Jacob watched her, completely still. His hand trembled as he brushed a bit of frost from her hair. He didn't even notice he was smiling, a small, bewildered smile that felt strange on a face unused to joy. When she finally stopped drinking, she let out a cry, not weak, not fading, but strong and angry. The kind of cry that told the world she wasn't done yet. The sound struck him deep, sharp as truth. It broke something open in him, the dam of a grief he'd built with his own hands. That cry echoed off the walls, and Jacob found himself laughing through the ache. A sound, rusty and wild. "Lord help me," he said, rocking her awkwardly. "You're loud as thunder." The baby blinked up at him, her eyes wide and unfocused. And for a moment, he thought he saw his wife there, not her face exactly, but the same quiet light she used to have when she'd cradle strays by the fire. He looked down at the shawl she was wrapped in, the stitched initials A.M. Didn't even notice they matched his wife's name. He just said softly, "Annie. That's what I'll call you, Annie." It felt right, like something chosen by the wind itself. Hours passed. The storm outside eased. Inside, the fire glowed steady and gold. Jacob sat in his chair, the baby sleeping against his chest, his rough hand resting over her tiny back. He hummed a hymn his mother used to sing, slow, broken, but still somehow whole. He didn't pray aloud, but the song was close enough to a prayer. And when the first light of dawn touched the frost on the window, he whispered, "Guess it's you and me now." "Kid," Annie stirred, sighed, the sound of trust, small and absolute. Jacob leaned his head back, eyes closing. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Inside, a man who thought his heart had frozen solid felt the faintest warmth return, not from the fire, but from the weight of that child breathing steady in his arms. He whispered one last thing before sleep took him. "You showed up in a storm, little one, maybe to remind me it ain't over yet." And for the first time in years, Jacob Rowe slept not haunted, not hollow, but holding something that felt a whole lot like life. By the third day, the snow had thinned into a dull white crust that crunched under every step. Jacob Rowe saddled his mare before daylight, wrapped the baby in his wife's old blanket, and tucked her inside his coat. He didn't much like going into town, not since Sarah's funeral, but the goat's milk was running low, and the baby's cough had a sharp edge that frightened him more than the cold ever could. The trail to Hollow Creek was quiet that morning. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the first light of sun glowed pale against the frozen roofs. Jacob rode slow, whispering now and then to calm the little one pressed against his chest. When she stirred, he smiled. "You and me, Annie. We're just passing through." He meant it, too. He wasn't looking for company, just medicine, supplies. and maybe a little advice he could trust. The bell above Harmon's general store rang as he stepped inside, and 15 heads turned all at once. Men at the stove stopped mid-sentence. 2 women near the bolts of cloth went still, eyes wide. A baby's cry had no business in that room, not in the arms of a man like Jacob Rowe. He kept his head down, moving toward the counter. "Morning," he said quietly. "Need milk powder, some blankets, and anything for a cough." Nobody answered right away. Just a low hum of whispering, the kind that moves like wind through tall grass. "That's Rowe." "Ain't it?" someone muttered. "Thought he swore off people after his wife died. What's he doin' with a baby?" Jacob felt the words hit his back like pebbles. He didn't turn, didn't rise to it. He just waited. Then came another voice, steady, warm, and female. "I'll help you. Mr. Rowe." He looked up. Martha Hale, owner of the boarding house, stood behind the counter, gray hair pinned neat, eyes kind but sharp. She moved with the easy authority of someone who'd seen both hard times and good ones. "Let me see her," she said softly. Jacob hesitated, then eased the bundle open. Martha's breath caught. "Well, would you look at that face?" She touched the baby's cheek with the back of her hand. "She's warm now. That's good. You've done right by her." Jacob nodded once, unsure what to say. "Just need to keep her fed and breathing," he muttered. "That's how it starts." Martha smiled. "The rest follows." She turned to the shelves, gathering bottles, cloth, and a small jar of liniment. "Here," she said. "This'll help that cough. And you'll need more milk. I've got a goat out back that won't miss a pint or two." Jacob blinked, surprised by her ease. "Appreciate that, ma'am," as she worked. The store filled again with murmurs, curiosity thick as dust. Then the door swung open, bringing in the sheriff. Henry Boone, tall, fair-haired, calm in every motion. He tipped his hat to Martha, then to Jacob. "Morning." "Rowe, Sheriff." Boone's eyes drifted to the baby, then back to Jacob. "You sure you want to raise her alone?" he asked. His voice wasn't mocking, just steady, like a man asking if another had thought things through. Jacob met his gaze. "Only thing lonelier than a man without hope," he said, "is a child without one." For a moment, the whole room went still. Boone's face softened. "Fair enough," he said quietly. "If you need anything, you know where I am." Then, from near the stove, came a scrape of boots and the slow rise of a different kind of presence, heavier, colder. Silas Dunn, owner of the Dunn Ranch, stepped forward. He was the kind of man who filled space coat of black wool, gloves like polished leather, a face carved from pride. Everyone in Hollow Creek knew him, and most feared him a little. "Didn't expect to see you back in town, Rowe," he said, voice smooth as ice. Jacob didn't answer. Silas's gaze dropped to the baby. Whose child? Found her in the snow by Hollow Creek. Found her a pause. And something sharp flickered behind his eyes, not pity, not surprise, but recognition, as if the word struck a memory he'd rather bury. "Somebody's missing a child." "Then," he said. "Maybe," Jacob answered. "But until I find them, she's safe with me." Silas studied him a long time. Then he nodded once, almost politely, but his jaw was tight. "I see." He turned, pulled on his gloves. and left. The bell rang again, closing behind him, and the store seemed to exhale all at once. Martha leaned close. "You ignore that man's tone," she whispered. "He's got more land than compassion." Jacob adjusted the blanket around Annie. "She don't need compassion from him," he said quietly. "She's got enough here." Martha smiled, a little proud, a little sad. "You'll do just fine." Jacob Rowe. Sometimes the right thing don't look proper to folks who never lost anything worth keeping. He nodded, bought what he needed. As he stepped back into the cold, he could still feel every set of eyes watching from behind frosted windows, curious, judging, uncertain. But the baby's tiny hand had worked its way out of the blanket, gripping his finger like a promise, and that was enough. He looked once toward the horizon where Silas Dunn's land stretched out in the distance like a shadow, and then back toward home. "Don't you worry, Annie," he murmured. "I reckon the good Lord put you in my path for a reason." The wind carried his words across the frozen street, soft as prayer. And somewhere deep inside the town that whispered about him, something new began to stir, quiet, cautious, but real, a little like hope. Winter loosened its grip on Hollow Creek by slow degrees, like an old hand unclenching. The days grew longer, the air softer, snowmelt ran down the gullies, and the sound of dripping water replaced the moan of the wind. Inside his cabin, Jacob Rowe moved like a man who'd found a rhythm again. The hearth was never cold now. The baby, his baby, as he thought of her more and more, had color in her cheeks and laughter that filled the one-room home like sunlight. He talked to her about everything. About the stubborn mule that wouldn't pull the cart, about fence lines and the coming thaw. And though she was only a few months old, she'd stare at him with those wide, unblinking eyes, as if she already understood. He'd laugh softly. "Don't look at me that way, Annie. You'll make me think I still matter." And for the first time in 2 long years, he did. The town, too, began to change toward him. Martha Hale visited once a week with bread and advice he didn't ask for but always needed. Sheriff Boone stopped by on his patrols, bringing news. Sometimes just silence and a cup of coffee shared by the fire. Even the whispers had softened. What began as suspicion had turned into something closer to respect. Life, as fragile as it was, had started to bloom again. Jacob tended to Annie with the care of a man who knew how much could be lost and how fast. Every night, he'd hum her to sleep, and every morning, she'd wake with a grin that reminded him why he got out of bed. Then one afternoon, when the light slanted long and golden through the cabin window, a letter came. It bore a wax seal, deep red, pressed with a lawyer's mark. He almost didn't open it. Nothing good ever came from paper that fancy, but something about the handwriting, precise, practiced, made his gut twist. He slid a knife along the edge, unfolded it. The words were inked in careful lines, and by the 3rd sentence, his heart was pounding. "Sir, my name is Charles Wainwright, attorney at law, representing Mr. Silas Dunn of Clay County, Missouri." Jacob read it once, then twice. Each line hit harder than the last. "It has come to our client's attention that you are currently in possession of an infant girl, approximately 3 months of age. Said child is believed to be the biological daughter of Miss Lillian Dunn, deceased, and her husband, Aaron Miller, also deceased. Miss Dunn was the estranged daughter of Mr. Silas Dunn. Before her passing, she left the child in the care of a trustworthy man near Hollow Creek. until such time as her father could be notified. Mr. Dunn now requests immediate return of his granddaughter. As is his legal and moral right, the paper shook in Jacob's hands. His throat went dry. He whispered to no one. Lillian Dunn, the initials on the shawl A. M. Aaron Miller. The truth settled like ice in his stomach. He sat there a long while, staring at the letter, the edges trembling between his fingers. Outside, the wind had picked up again. It rattled the shutters and made the horses restless in the pen. Annie stirred in her crib. Sensing something, Jacob looked over. Voice breaking, "She is family," he said quietly. "She's mine." But the paper on the table said otherwise. He stood, paced, then sat again, a man fighting a storm no one else could see. He read the letter a third time, hoping the words might change. They didn't. When Martha Hale arrived later that evening with soup and her easy laugh, Jacob didn't greet her at the door. He just handed her the letter. She read it once, lips pressed tight. Then again, slower. "Oh, Jacob," she whispered. Her eyes were wet before she even finished. Lillian Dunn was Silas's girl. You know that family pride, thicker than blood. He cut her off when she married that Miller boy. Folks said he swore she was dead to him. Jacob's voice was low, steady, dangerous. Well, she ain't the only one he's buried. He turned toward the cradle where Annie slept. One tiny fist curled against her cheek. "She's all I've got. Martha, I won't let him take her." "Jacob," Martha began, but he cut her off with a look. "You think that man's gonna raise her gentle? You think he knows what it means to sit up all night, 'cause you can't tell if she's breathing, or to feed her when your hands are shaking too bad to hold the bottle? No, ma'am. He don't know a damn thing about love." Martha stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "Maybe not, but he's got money, influence, the law, too. You can't fight that kind of power alone." Jacob met her eyes. "I'm not fighting with money or law. I'm fighting with what's right. And if that ain't enough, then the world's colder than I thought." The wind slammed the shutters again, hard this time, like a warning. Somewhere outside, the mare whinnied, uneasy. Martha flinched at the sound. "Silas Dunn doesn't forget a thing," she said softly. "And he doesn't forgive, either." Jacob stared into the fire, the letter curling slightly in the heat from the stove. He thought about the night he'd found Annie in the snow, how close she'd been to dying, how her tiny hand had clung to him like she already knew who he was. "Let him come," Jacob murmured. He looked down at the child, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering on her horizon. "She was left in my path for a reason, and I'm not handing her back to the man who made her mother run from home in the first place." Martha hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Then you'd best be ready." Jacob Rowe. When Silas Dunn wants something, he don't stop till he's got it. Jacob glanced at the fire, then at the letter. He fed the paper to the flames. The wax seal melted, the ink blackened, and the words that threatened his peace turned to ash. He whispered one last thing, voice steady again. "Family isn't who claims you. It's who stays when the world turns mean." Outside, the night deepened, and the wind rose. Somewhere far off, a rider left the Dunn Ranch, carrying word that the old man was on his way. And inside that cabin at Hollow Creek, Jacob held the child a little closer, as if love alone could keep her safe. By the time Silas Dunn arrived in Hollow Creek, spring had only half awakened. Snow still clung to the hollows, and the sky hung gray and heavy as old tin. His carriage rolled into town with the slow arrogance of money and power, black horses, brass trim, and two lawyers sitting stiff as fence posts beside him. Inside the general store, talk had already turned feverish. Folks claimed Silas came not just to reclaim a child, but to remind Hollow Creek who truly owned its soul. By evening, the sheriff called a meeting at the town hall, that small wooden building where marriages, funerals, and every kind of judgment took place. Jacob Rowe came carrying the baby. He'd dressed her in Martha's cleanest white cloth, the same shawl she'd been found in. When he stepped inside, the room went silent, only the squeak of boots on pine and the quiet coo of the infant in his arms. At the front, Silas Dunna stood tall, wrapped in his wealth like armor. He was older than Jacob remembered, but his presence still carried weight. His eyes were sharp, his mouth a hard, thin line that looked like it hadn't smiled in a decade. "Mr. Rowe," he began, voice echoing against the walls. "I thank you for your temporary guardianship. You've done your duty, but I'll be taking my granddaughter home now." Jacob's grip tightened around Annie. "She's already home," he said quietly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Silas's lawyer stepped forward, paper in hand, voice clipped and cold. "My client is prepared to compensate you for your trouble, Mr. Rowe, a generous sum, I assure you. But the child is of the Dunn line, and her place is with her kin. She ain't trouble." Jacob said, "She's life." The lawyer hesitated, but Silas didn't. He took a single step closer. "You're a good man, Rowe. I don't doubt it. But you're not her blood, and blood matters." At that, Martha Hale rose from her seat near the stove. Her voice was steady, but the fire in it drew every eye. "You can't measure love in property deeds, Mr. Dunne," she said. "Blood don't make a home. Care does. And that man's been caring for her since the night she was near dead." A few folks nodded. Others looked away. Unwilling to cross Silas Dunn, Silas turned toward her. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "you're a kind woman, but sentiment doesn't change what's right." "No," Martha said softly. "It just reminds us what wrong looks like." The sheriff, Henry Boone, stood then, trying to keep the peace. "Let's keep it civil. Folks, we all know the law's clear on matters of guardianship, but I'd ask we don't forget our humanity either." Silas's lawyers whispered to him, passing papers back and forth. The sheriff read through them, frowning. After a long pause, he sighed. "By order of the territorial court, temporary custody of the minor child, known as Annie Miller, is granted to Mr. Silas Dunna, pending a formal hearing in 3 weeks' time." The room erupted shouts, curses, gasps. Jacob didn't move. He stood there like a man carved from grief and grit, holding the baby who had unknowingly divided an entire town. Boone's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Rowe, the order says you've got until dawn to bring her to the Dunn carriage. That's the law." For a moment, Jacob didn't answer. He looked down at the child in his arms, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt, her breath warm against his chest. Then he nodded once. "Understood." Martha stepped forward, eyes wide with disbelief. "Jacob, you can't, I can," he interrupted softly. "For her sake, for now," He walked out without another word, the door closing behind him like the end of a prayer. Outside, the rain had started thin and cold. It slicked the mud on the road, turned the air heavy and gray. By the time he reached his cabin, the rain had thickened into sleet, rattling against the roof like small stones. Inside, he set the baby down, stoked the fire higher, then sat at his old table with a piece of paper and a trembling hand. He stared at the blank page a long time before the words came. My dearest Annie, if you're reading this, it means life carried you farther than I ever could. I found you on a night when everything I loved was buried under snow, when I didn't think a man could feel again. But you changed that. You saved a man who thought he was finished. He stopped, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and kept writing. Maybe the world will tell you that family is blood, or land, or money. Don't listen. Family is who stays when the world turns mean. Family is who fights for you when no one else will. The ink blurred where a tear fell. Jacob didn't bother to blot it. He folded the letter, slid it into the small cedar box Sarah had once kept her keepsakes in. Then he rose, walked to the cradle, and lifted Annie. She stirred, blinked, and made that small sound she always did when she was content, half sigh, half hum. Jacob smiled through the ache in his chest. Don't you worry, little one, he whispered. You'll be all right. You're stronger than you look, stronger than me. The wind outside howled. The roof creaked. Sleet rattled harder against the window. He held her closer, humming that same old hymn his mother used to sing, low and rough, like the voice of the land itself. By the time the fire burned low, the letter sat sealed on the table. Annie slept against his heart, her breath sinking with his own. He stared into the last of the embers until they glowed like memory, then whispered to the dark, Dawn's comin', and when it does, I'll do what I have to. He looked down at her once more, the baby who had given him back his soul, and for the first time since Sarah's funeral, Jacob Rowe wept. Outside, the sleet turned to snow again, falling soft and soundless like mercy itself. By dawn, the world had turned to white again. Snow came down heavy and unrelenting, swallowing fences, erasing trails, silencing everything but the wind. Inside the small cabin at Hollow Creek, Jacob Rowe waited, holding Annie close. He'd packed her blanket, her bottle, even her favorite carved rattle, a farewell no father should ever have to prepare. Then came the sound of hooves, faint at first, then louder, a muffled rhythm beneath the storm. Jacob stepped to the door before they could knock. When he opened it, the wind shoved through like an angry spirit. Two of Silas Dunn's men stood outside, faces red from cold, collars pulled high. Between them, bundled in wool and arrogance, stood Silas himself. Behind him, the carriage waited, horses restless in the gale. Mr. Rowe, Silas called out, voice raised above the storm. I've come for my granddaughter. Jacob didn't answer right away. He just looked down at the sleeping child in his arms. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, steady. She's not ready for that kind of cold. Sir, the cold won't harm her, Silas said, though even he flinched when the wind cut across his face. The law's decided, Jacob nodded once. Law and right ain't always the same thing. Silas's jaw tightened. Enough. Bring her. One of the men stepped forward, reaching out. The instant his hands neared her, Annie screamed a sound fierce enough to rattle the walls. Her little body arched away from the stranger's grasp, reaching instead for Jacob, her fists trembling in panic. "She's frightened," Jacob said, voice rising above the wind. "She knows what's safe." The other man tried again. Annie's screams only grew wilder, desperate. Even Silas hesitated now, eyes narrowing, breath fogging the air. "She'll calm once we're on the road," he muttered. But they never made it that far, because at that moment, the sky split open, and the real storm came, a blizzard, fast and furious, swallowing everything. The men turned their faces from the blast. "Mr. Dune, we can't travel in this." One shouted, "We'll never make the ridge." Within minutes, the carriage was half buried. The horses bucked and snorted, eyes rolling white. The sheriff's warning echoed in Jacob's mind. When Silas wants something, he don't stop till he's got it. But tonight, even Silas's will meant nothing against the will of the plains. "Get inside," Jacob said, "all of you, or you'll freeze where you stand." Pride battled reason for a long second, then Silas nodded. They stumbled in through the door, bringing half the storm with them. The men shook off snow, their fine coats soaked through. Silas stood near the fire, silent, as Jacob moved with practiced calm, feeding the flames, wrapping Annie tighter, humming the hymn she loved. The sound was low, almost lost beneath the wind's howl, but somehow it filled the room, that rough, tender tune from a man who'd learned love the hard way. 3 days the storm raged. 3 nights they all stayed trapped in that little cabin, the old rancher, the grieving grandfather, and the men who no longer knew what side they were on. On the first night, Martha Hale appeared through the white, her figure emerging like a ghost from the storm. She carried medicine under her coat, her horse near collapse from the ride. "Child's fever's rising," she said simply, setting to work without waiting for permission. Silas watched her too, this woman who braved death for someone else's baby. He watched Jacob feed the girl, soothe her with quiet murmurs, pace the floor until her crying softened into sleep. He watched how naturally the man's rough hands moved, gentle as prayer. And for the first time, Silas Dunn didn't see scandal or shame, he saw family. On the third night, when the wind finally began to tire, Silas spoke from his chair near the fire. His voice was soft, stripped of authority. "I buried my daughter's joy and pride," he said. "I told myself I was protecting her from poverty, from shame, but I was protecting my own vanity, and it killed her." Jacob didn't look up from the cradle where Annie slept. His voice was steady, quiet as a church bell in snow. "Then don't bury her child in the same grave." The words hung there, heavy and clear. Silas's eyes shone wet in the firelight. He nodded slowly, the weight of years falling from his shoulders. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed. The snow outside glowed pink in the sunrise, untouched and perfect. Inside, the old man sat beside the cradle, watching the baby breathe, his heart breaking open in ways he never expected. For the first time since Lillian's death, Silas Dunn prayed, not for power, not for forgiveness, but for courage, to be the kind of man his daughter might have loved. And Jacob Rowe, sitting beside him, just nodded. The hardest storms, he knew, weren't outside the door. They were the ones a man carried inside his own chest, until something pure and small reminded him how to let go. When the storm finally broke, Hollow Creek woke to a silence that felt like grace. The snow lay smooth and shining, as if the whole world had been forgiven overnight. For 3 days, no one had seen Silas Dunn. Jacob Rowe, or little Annie. Whispers had already begun. Some said the old man had taken the child. Others, that Jacob had vanished into the hills. But when the courthouse doors opened that cold January morning, both men walked in together. The sight stopped every conversation in its tracks. Jacob still looked like the man the town knew, worn, quiet, carrying the baby close to his chest. Silas, though, had changed. The storm had aged him 10 years. His eyes were rimmed red, not from wind, but from something deeper. Pride had melted off him, leaving behind a man stripped clean of excuses. The judge, Elias Franklin, sat at the bench, his robes stiff with self-importance. He was a territorial appointee, one of those men who measured truth by signatures and seals, not by hearts. Court is now in session, he said, voice echoing under the high wooden rafters. Case of custody regarding the minor child. Annie Miller. The lawyers stepped forward first, their words polished and sharp. They spoke of lineage, inheritance, the sanctity of bloodlines. They quoted scripture when it served their argument and ignored it when it didn't. Silas sat silent through it all, his gloved hands folded, eyes lowered. When Jacob was called to speak, he stood awkwardly, hat in hand, Annie's small blanket tucked under his arm. He didn't have papers, or money, or a name that carried weight. All he had were the nights he'd stayed awake holding a crying baby, the days he'd prayed for one more breath when her fever spiked, and the quiet miracle of hearing her laugh in his arms. I ain't got much to say, he began. His voice was rough, but steady. I found her half buried in the snow. She wasn't breathing right. I didn't think she'd make it through the night. He looked down at Annie, who blinked up at him, clutching his finger with both tiny hands. But she did, and I reckon she kept me alive just as much as I kept her. He paused. Maybe blood's what brings you into this world, but it ain't what keeps you in it. Ain't about who she's born to, it's about who shows up when she needs someone. He looked over at Silas then, not with anger, but with quiet understanding. I know what it is to lose. I wouldn't wish that on any man, not even one who's done wrong. But I also know what it is to love something that don't owe you a thing. And that's what she is to me. A gift I didn't deserve, but I won't let go. The room went still. Even the judge leaned back slightly. Eyes softened despite himself. The only sound was the baby's small breath and the low creak of the wood stove. Then Silas rose. The lawyers started to object, but he silenced them with a single glance. He walked slowly to the center of the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. Your Honor, he said quietly, there's no more case to argue. He turned toward Jacob, then toward the crowd that filled the benches. My daughter chose this man. She saw what I couldn't, a heart that still believes in goodness. Even after everything's been taken. A murmur ran through the room. Silas went on, his voice gaining strength. I spent years building fences around my name, my land, my pride. And in doing so, I fenced out the very things that made life worth keeping. When Lillian left, I thought she'd shamed me. But it wasn't her sin that ruined our family. It was my pride. He turned to the judge. I withdraw my claim. The child stays with Mr. Rowe. That's where her mother would have wanted her. The judge blinked, thrown off his script. Mr. Dunn, do you understand the implications once withdrawn? I understand, Silas interrupted. Firm now. And I'll not take another thing from that child, but I'll do right by her. In whatever way a man like me still can. He looked at Jacob. I'll establish a trust in her name. For her schooling. Her future. No strings. No ownership. Just care. Jacob stood. His voice low. Cares more than money. Mr. Dunn. Silas nodded. Eyes glistening. I know. That's why I'm asking your permission to visit sometimes. Not as a master. As a grandfather, Jacob studied him a long moment. Then slowly nodded. Reckon she deserves that. Long as you remember what you just said. A faint smile touched Silas's mouth, the first in years. I will. From the back of the room. Martha Hale rose, wiping her eyes with her apron. About time Hollow Creek saw what mercy looks like, she said softly. The judge cleared his throat. Voice thick. This court recognizes the guardianship of Annie Miller under Mr. Jacob Rowe. Full custody granted. Case dismissed. The gavel struck once. Loud and final. No one cheered. Instead, something quieter happened, something holier. People stood, one by one, hats removed, heads bowed, not out of duty, but out of respect. Annie stirred, letting out a small giggle that bounced under the courthouse rafters. Light and pure. It drew smiles even from those who'd come expecting to see a fight. For the first time, no one in Hollow Creek looked away. Silas stepped closer, reaching out a hand. Jacob shifted Annie so the old man could touch her cheek. Her tiny fingers grabbed his thumb, holding tight. Guess she forgives easy. Silas said, voice trembling. Jacob smiled faintly. Babies do. The trick's keepin' that forgiveness when they grow. Silas chuckled quiet, raw, almost disbelieving. Well, he said, maybe she'll teach me how. As they walked out into the pale sunlight, the snow glittered like the whole town had been washed clean. Silas paused on the steps, looking out at the horizon, the same hills his daughter had once ridden toward, chasing a life of her own choosing. He whispered, rest easy. Lillian, she's home. Behind him, Jacob Rowe carried Annie into that light, her laughter soft against his chest. The people of Hollow Creek parted to let him pass, tipping their hats in silent greeting. And for the first time in years, the old frontier town felt like it belonged not to the powerful, but to the good, because love, simple, stubborn, undeserved love had won the day. And in the rafters of that worn old courthouse, the echo of a baby's laughter lingered, bright as bells. By the time spring found Hollow Creek, it came gently, like someone knocking soft on the door after a long winter of silence. The snow was gone now, replaced by the slow trickle of meltwater winding through the meadows. The cottonwoods wore new buds, and the air smelled of rain and wood smoke instead of frost and fear. Jacob Rowe stood where the ice had once nearly claimed them both, at the bend in the creek where he'd found the basket half buried months ago. But the basket wasn't there anymore. He'd kept it, mended it, and hung it by the cabin door, a reminder of the night God handed him a second chance. Now, the ground was soft again. Wildflowers had begun to bloom in quiet patches, delicate and sure purple, yellow and blue. In his hands, Jacob held a small tin of seeds, forget-me-nots. Martha had brought them from town. Beside him, Martha knelt in the wet earth, holding Annie steady on her lap. the little girl, now nearly a year old, babbled at the sunlight, grabbing at the petals and laughing when the wind played with her hair. Jacob smiled and pressed the seeds into the soil. "Your mama was brave," he said softly. "Did you know that, Annie, she loved you enough to give you a chance when she couldn't stay? And because of her, we're all still here." Martha looked up, eyes warm, the breeze lifting strands of her gray hair. "She'd be proud of you both," she said. Jacob glanced toward the horizon where the Dune estate sat miles away, hidden beyond the rolling hills. "Maybe," he murmured, "maybe she's proud of him, too," because standing a few yards away, hat in hand, was Silas Dunn. He looked smaller now, not in stature, but in spirit, as if he'd laid down the weight he'd carried for years. His fine coat was simple, his boots muddy, his eyes, once hard as iron, were tired but kind. He approached slow, stopping a few steps short. "Mind if I join you?" Jacob nodded. Martha handed him the baby without a word. Silas held Annie close, awkward at first, then tenderly, the way a man holds something he knows he doesn't deserve but is grateful to touch all the same. Annie reached for his beard, tugged, then laughed, pure and unafraid. Silas smiled through tears he didn't bother to hide. "Your mother forgave me, little one," he whispered, voice shaking. "Guess I'll spend the rest of my days learning how to deserve that." Jacob turned the last handful of soil, patting it gently around the cluster of forget-me-nots. "Reckon she just wanted peace," he said. "We all did." The wind carried the scent of the flowers downstream, mingling with the sound of water and birds returning from the south. No one spoke for a long while. There didn't need to be words. Just the quiet grace of three souls, bound together by loss, and something stronger love that had learned to forgive. When the sun dipped low behind the hills, they rode back toward the cabin, 3 generations of a family that shouldn't have existed, yet somehow did. That night, the fire burned soft and steady. Martha sat near the table, her voice calm as she read from the Bible that had belonged to Jacob's wife. "Where you go, I will go," she read aloud, smiling as Annie reached for the sound of her voice. "And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people." Jacob sat in the rocker, Annie asleep in his arms, her small head tucked under his chin. He looked toward Martha and smiled, a slow, knowing smile that held every mile of the journey behind them. "Guess we all found our way home," he said. Outside, the creek whispered, the wind hummed low through the pines, and inside that humble cabin, there was nothing left of winter except memory and the warmth of a fire that would never go out again. Because sometimes the West doesn't give you what you ask for. It gives you what you need: a reason to stay, a hand to hold, and a heart to start over with. And that, my friends, is the story of spring at Hollow Creek, a story about pride, forgiveness, and how love can still grow in the coldest ground. If this tale stirred something in you tonight, I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? What did this story make you feel? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Western Tales so you never miss another journey across the wild, quiet heart of the American frontier. Until next time, ride steady. Keep your fire burning. And remember, even out here, hope always finds its way home.